Hello, and welcome to the Kink Perspective. My name's Chris. I'm a psychotherapist and consultant. On this episode, I'm going to talk a little bit about something that's different, and it does impact BDSM, and it's impacting communities, workplaces, religions throughout the world. It goes by an acronym of D.I.E, or the D.I.E philosophy: diversity, equity, or diversity, inclusion, and equity, or equality, depending on how you see to translate that acronym. It's a terrible philosophy because the first thing that the DIE acronym and the diehard believers of the woke mantra interpret it is that meritocracy, so where you should be able to do something because you are the most highly skilled or most well-trained person to do the job or be in a certain position, doesn't matter as much as long as we're making up enough of a color matrix to everybody. There's no stranger of this now in university systems, in the workforce, military. It really doesn't matter. When I was in academia, I saw this. We had DIE statements. It was about applying for grants. It wasn't about what your research was. It didn't really matter whether or not your idea, your hypothesis was valid. They wanted to know how you identified sexually. They wanted to know what your gender role was, how you include safe spaces for people. That has nothing to do with the world of research. That has now become the standard quo on job applications, and these things used to be restricted. They were against the law. You couldn't ask somebody about what their sexual orientation was, what their you could ask them about gender, but you can't discriminate against on it. But asking who somebody likes to sleep with or their sexual preferences, that was illegal. Now it doesn't matter. Now we want to include everybody. There are certain things in this world that are private, and they're not made for everybody else's consumption. But the world has changed, and there are some people who are embracing that, and there are certain aspects of that I believe in. I like diversity. Diversity is great because I can learn from many people from many different backgrounds and cultures and religions about doing something. We can work together and maybe get it done faster. But diversity, when it comes at a cost, when inclusion comes at a cost, when equality comes at a cost, and it's not for the same, then we're not really doing it to be the same. We're doing it because we're saying so. We're doing it when we feel threatened that we're not being heard. So when we don't no longer agree, what ends up happening? We end up calling you names. We end up saying things about people. One example, when we talk about inclusion, what somebody really means is restricting speech and justifying for purges against other people. And I want to kind of jump right in. I know I've been talking about a minute and giving a little bit of background here, but what I'm really talking about, especially when it comes to BDSM has always been inclusive. It has been a world that we can all identify, that people who come to it are accepted. Now, BDSM, especially 20, 30 years ago, when I kind of crashed into the scene, I was still brand new. I was really wet behind the ears. There was all sorts of representation there. Queer, straight, Hispanic, black, Italians. It really didn't matter. The difference was I wasn't asking about your racial makeup or your sexual orientation if you were going to get involved in a scene. None of that mattered. I wasn't looking there. I wasn't looking to check a diversity box so I could say how cool I was about, look, I have this transgendered BIPOC, they, them, because the stuff didn't exist. Just didn't. There wasn't even a need for it. We were there to enjoy the scene. We were there to learn from each other. In the last 10 years, as this prevalence has gone on, we see this rise in the words of inclusivity. We see the rise in the words of diversity and equality. I just have been reading more and more social media posts about these things and how they quote unquote affect people. Being a therapist, when I look at people's emotions, I want to know how something reacts. But if you're reading other people's words and you're becoming emotionally separated and you're not able to disconnect from what somebody's saying that has nothing to do with you, and you're imposing what they're talking about in a different manner but making it relevant towards yourself, it's not the people who have written the post that are problematic. It's yourself. And you need to talk to somebody about that. You need to understand why you're going through these certain emotions, where in your life that you're feeling emotional stunting, that you're now being offended by what other people say, and then you're trying to qualify that in some random generality. And a specific example of this happened a couple examples happened this past weekend. On one website, on the multitude between Alt and Instagram and TikTok and Snapchat and all these places, a post came across that somebody was mad about the inclusion of pronouns. Now, frankly, the world doesn't run on pronouns. I don't constantly run around and refer to my colleagues as they or them. I don't do it for myself. You can call me Chris. You can call me by my last name. And then that's it. And if that's not easy enough to do, then I don't know. I will call you, but by what you want me to call you. But beyond that, I don't really try to make it anymore, because the problem is this maintains the second part of this. This maintains a victimhood. You're constantly allowing yourself. These people are constantly keeping themselves in perpetual victimhood, and they always find a way to continually do outrage. And then what ends up happening is, and there's an apology, and then they just move on to the next part of being a victim. There is no healing process. There really is never getting over anything, because they don't want to. These people are always, who's ever identifying in this particular moment, is always looking for a reason to be a victim. And that's problematic. That's not a community that is structuring it in a way where you want to be in charge. It structures it in a way that it's all identity based. You're making that approach to society only your way. You are saying we want everything to be equal, but the moment you disagree with us, you are ostracized. So none of that works. And these become the complaints. These are the complaints by these very people that they end up doing to others. So to get back to this post this past weekend, somebody I'm becoming friends with wrote something, and I don't necessarily agree with everything somebody writes about BDSM. We all have our different takes. Again, remember, there are no rules. We're still kind of slowly making things up as we go along. For some of us, we do follow patterns of protocols and rituals, things that have been laid out for generations before us, and we enjoy those things. And that, I think, is part of the problem, is that people have really kind of strayed from all of that. They've just said, not BDSM is me cuffing you and taking you in the bedroom and having sex with you. Well, that's not BDSM. BDSM and sex have never been synonymous. And the problem is this ideal has been soiled by those in social media that are claiming they are sex positive and they're out there having sex, and then they're calling themselves, spank me daddy, or I screwed my baby girl. All of these things that they end up saying, these exactly muddy the waters of what we're trying, and muddy the clarity of what really BDSM is. You no longer really even understand it. And the majority of people that I end up interviewing about how much they know about BDSM, what their experiences are. Frankly, talking to some new clients recently, I thought I knew what BDSM was, but the reality is I didn't want to look into it or read about it because I didn't want to end up having to educate somebody else. So I just stayed at their same level. And this is about the same typical answer I receive all the time. No one really attends a class. No one really goes to a dungeon party. No one really goes to an events. No one's really asking questions. They don't have mentors. Well, I have probably said this analogy. I write about it all the time. I've talked about it on my podcast where I talk about calling yourself a mechanic, right? I can say I identify as a mechanic. I know I can fix cars, but I have never been trained. Well, you may get lucky and you might replace some oil without screwing up the car too bad, but probably beyond some simplistic things, you're not going to really be able to service a car, right? You're not going to be able to change tires or rip out a transmission or change a clutch or fix a cracked block because you haven't been trained. But yet you're calling yourself a mechanic. You've opened yourself up a shop in your corner of the world and you're inviting customers in. Well, more than likely your reputation is going to get ruined. You are going to get sued depending on where you live in the world, and you're going to end up being out of pocket for a lot of costs, and you're going to end up looking like a fool. So the same thing kind of goes into BDSM. You actually have to put effort into the lifestyle, or you're not going to get anything back. And the majority of the people that I see that do all of these things in the name of diversity and inclusion and equity or equality, they never really are doing more they're not doing a lot for the community, except what they are doing is bitching about the community. They're complaining about it. So my first question to you, for those who listen and challenge me and get back to me in emails, is what are you actually doing when you say that the community is not for you? I will stand behind and stand next to you and lead the charge for anyone that's being a racist jerk off, that's saying, you can't be here because you're disabled or you're trained. I will happily stand there because kink is for everyone. But when none of those things are presenting, and then you are now picking arguments with people because they don't see your way in the name of inclusion, this is when it starts becoming problematic. So getting back to this weekend, because I've digressed a little bit. This person that I know wrote something in this perspective about submissives. I didn't necessarily agree with the sentiment, and so when I agree, I tend not to comment. He's still on his exploration about BDSM. He's still learning about the world, so he's expressing his thoughts and feelings. Nothing wrong with that. It's just part of the world where he's doing that on social media, right? Just like we tell everybody else, you are allowed to say what you want to say. And express your thoughts and feelings. We are supposed to encourage this, especially in men, right? Because I often hear from my female clients, well, my husband or my partner never says this to me. How do I get him to emotionally open up? Well, the only way you're going to do that is by allowing men to talk. But then when men talk and they express their feelings, they're more often than not, they're demonized. And that's problematic. But again, I'm digressing. So he wrote this thing. It got out there, gained some traction. So this person who ends up identifying somewhere in the LGBT spectrum of alphabet soup ends up saying they're offended that he wrote this, and they are offended that he didn't change the pronouns and all. So I see all of this support and condemnation for this person that I know. Now, he didn't write this piece for them. He wrote it for himself. So instantly, when I contact this person, I'm like, don't you dare issue an apology, because the moment you apologize to this woke brigade, you lose ground completely. You can never then really do another think piece that's independent. I personally, this is why the other therapists that I see that operate within the kink community, a lot of the times, and I just actually told a colleague that I haven't spoken to in a while, and I just told a colleague today, I don't give podcasts here. I don't write things. I don't have discussions or attend panels because I want to pander. That means if I'm pandering to you and I'm giving you the insight on the things you want to hear about and only believing in that small percentage, which is not the way the real world operates, is slowly that dogma is taking over. If I give the contrary side, if I give you a factually based side, whether you like me or not, at least I'm presenting my side. And I'm standing by my own convictions. I don't apologize, especially when I'm not wrong. And I told my friend, you didn't do anything wrong. Don't apologize. If you do, you cede ground. You have now, in linguistic warfare, you have ceded ground from this point forward. Never write again. Because anything you write, they will take out of context. They will attack you. They will gather the troops, and then they will try to cancel you. And that's problematic. And this person who wrote this off-edited opinion piece about being offended and about, um, by not doing pronouns, it's not inclusive enough. You know what, though? The piece wasn't written for you. And we have to stop doing this in society. We've gotten to the point in our outside world, outside of kink, we have gotten to the point where we are offended by everything. I'm offended by people who are offended because I think you don't have the mental capacity to be operating in the world. And people will say to me, well, Chris, how can you say that? You work as a therapist. You're supposed to help people. No, I can't help everyone, and I help a select few. I'm a trauma-informed therapist. I work with people who have trauma. But by being offended, by growing up, and I am really talking about people about 30 and under, I don't really understand what's happened as far as cognitive adults 30 and over, because they know that the world wasn't like this. They've somehow bought into this dogma that things aren't diverse enough. Now, I do agree there are some companies that out there that haven't gone, but that's their choice. These are private equity firms. It's their capital that they're putting up. So if they want to be all female, congratulations. I can care less. But the world's not operating that way anymore. Now we're just offended. We're offended that there's not a person of color. It doesn't matter if that person isn't even qualified. There needs to be a person of color, right? We will happily kick out somebody who has spent 15 years doing research and is very knowledgeable about a subject. We're going to kick them out because, well, it doesn't make up the racial makeup. So I'm sorry, that in itself is racism. But we don't want to see it that way, right? Where we mask it under the guise of diversity. I'm seeing this in BDSM panels. Recently, I was invited to a BDSM panel with a very big group that operates about kink and inclusion, diversity, and multiculturalism. And I said, I looked at it, and I looked at what they had to say. I wanted to check out their presenters. Out of all their presenters that were on there, on these talks about ableism and ageism and different things that they were going to be speaking about, and diversity and inclusion, there wasn't actually a qualified person to be on there. Now, these were all going to be people that were going to get into this panel, that they were speaking from their own experiences. There's nothing wrong with that. Now, those are subjective opinions, meaning they're their opinions based on emotional responses. They're not objective opinions based on factual responses. But what we've done now is we are really removing objective thinking, and we are now, under the D.I.E philosophy, have brought in this whole mantra of my emotional state trumps factual response. And that's, I just don't agree with. My field is based in science. What I've done before was based in research. I operate within facts. I operate within reason. If someone says ow, and it's not in a good way, that means it hurts. That's a fact. They're not thinking they said ow. They're not considering they said ow. They're not worrying they said ow because that might offend somebody else in the room. The ow actually hurt. But that doesn't matter anymore. I was at an event recently this past, and I was giving a speech or giving a talk about trauma and BDSM. And when I was talking to people, somebody asked me, well, what makes me think that I'm qualified to work with people of different races, let alone sexual orientations and sexualities and gender identities? What makes me qualified? What makes me qualified is that I'm a trauma-informed specialist, that I've spent years going to school, that I have a master's degree in psychology, that I have worked with people from all over the world, from different cultures and backgrounds. And personally, I would go to see somebody if I'm going to a medical doctor and I want to see my shoulder's dislocated or it's been broken. I want to see the best qualified person in that field. I'm not going to be worried about if they're checking some diversity box. Great, I'm going to go and see some person that was just a diversity hire, but that's not as qualified as the guy who has 35 years of experience treating these people. But this is where we've gotten. So when I looked at them and I asked that question, I said, I'm not there to treat who they sleep with, how they identify, how they sexually feel, or what they sexually want. I'm there to treat their problems and try to help them find a solution to live the rest of their life in some sort of form of peace, or at least maintain it. Well, they've got mixed reviews, and that's fine. Not everybody's meant to think the way I think, and that's okay. But when we start talking about everything must be equal, well, it becomes problematic because not all things are equal. Not everybody has the same bone density. Not everybody has the same circumference on their necks or their stomachs or their legs. We're all different. I'm not a rigger, right? Rigging is, I think it's got its own beauty and its own innate thing, but that's for a different discussion on a different day. But I know that if a rigger is probably going to have to use a different thickness or tensile strength of rope with someone of a different weight class, like myself. I'm a big guy, 6 foot tall. So if I was going to let somebody suspend me, they're going to probably have to use a different type of rope to suspend me versus some girl that is about half my weight. There's no way that's equal. But what I'm not going to do is I'm not going to be upset about it. I'm also not going to demand it is some rando person that ticks all the diversity boxes that doesn't really know what they're doing versus some rigger, man, woman, or somewhere in between that has 10 years of experience, and I'm going to want to see them. We're missing out in this D.I.E philosophy on the people that can help advance our time within the community. It's not a community when we are constantly ostracizing people because they don't fit this makeup that the world and some sort of small fractal group of people have decided no longer matter. That's problematic. That's exclusionary. It comes back to the same arguments of what they are saying. We're not included. Well, great. Well, you're included. We don't really care. Come have some fun. No. Now I want to change the rules because they're not enough. Or now I want to change who makes the rules. Now I want to change who leads. Well, now it's gone from demand. It's gone from requests to demands, almost like an aggravated child. A lot of the times when I see these things, the other part of it too is when they start making threats and they start using this tone that we'll get you canceled, we'll do this. Well, there's a word for that. I'm not going to say it because I don't believe it, and I don't like tossing this word around. Now, I worked in this field for a decade when I was in the military. This is what my first degree lies in. But the definition of this word comes into getting things to change, usually getting things of political change done through threats of violence or action, right? That involves some sort of threat. You can probably figure out what I'm talking about. It's not quite on that level, but I mean, it's slowly going that way. Oh, I don't like what you have to say. You're not diverse enough. Well, guess what? Now I'm going to tell all the people not to use your business, so you're canceled. So you're threatening my livelihood because you don't agree with me, or I haven't fallen at your footsteps begging for you to come use my business. Well, it doesn't really work that way. And I personally don't fall prey to it. It's why I don't work for a big corporation. It's why I left working for a large corporation, working in their wellness department, right? Because there's too many boxes you've got to check. That's why I work privately. I don't want to see, and don't get me wrong, I like diversity, right? I don't like diversity to the point of when they mean it's going to violate someone's individual identity. And they're enforcing some sort of mantra of intellectual conformity, right? It becomes a guise of political conformity and quotas. And these become attacks on the merit, and they are a form of soft bigotry. So when we're talking about diversity, that's what we're really starting to say. When it comes back to inclusion, like this person was talking about, what they're ultimately really saying beyond restricting speech, like they were saying, they weren't happy that this person I knew didn't make this his comments for everybody gender neutral. Instead of going out and just writing their own comment, they berated my friend, or this person I knew, and they linked to all of his social media, and they had, they got the troops fired up. I'm sorry, so how's that inclusive? How is that being part of the community, drawing anger and creating a fire where there is not one? How is that a sense of belonging? When he didn't do anything to you, you just took something out of context and decided to become angry about it. What they're really talking about is they only make people feel welcomed by banning anything they find offensive. And these people are defining what's offensive for everyone. It's the same when I hear about women who are, and I see this writings all the time about women under 25 should never date anybody older because ultimately they can't make a decision and they're being manipulated. And then when I hear that argument, my first response to them is I say to anybody, man or woman who writes this, or anybody in between, what you're telling me is that women are ignorant and incapable of dating. They can't make a decision, right? That's what they're saying whenever that comment comes out. That's this whole same mantra. These people are going to define what offensive is for everybody else. Well, that doesn't sound like an oligarchy at all. That doesn't sound like authoritarian at all, right? Everybody's offended by something else. What this truly comes down to is an attack on the freedoms of and associations of speech, an attack on what we write and our liberties. And I'm not talking about going out there and being a bigot and really like being racist. I'm not talking about that. That speech has nowhere, that doesn't belong in society. But what this person wrote wasn't bigoted. It wasn't hatred. He just wrote a piece about him being a man and his views on men and dominance and female submission. His perspective. But he was attacked for it. But again, this was under the guise of inclusion. And when we get to the word, my favorite word, of equity, what somebody really means when they talk to me about equity is they mean equality of outcomes, right? And that in reality is a true violation of equality before the law, dismantling of the foundations of a free society. Because I'm sorry, you have something I want and I don't have it, and I didn't really work for it, but I should have worked for it. So guess what? It's mine now. It's got to be all equal, right? The state of management of society, including reparations and all of these other discussions we start having about these things, it's not, it doesn't work. We have to start getting back away from where we are, finding the reason why we all came to kink in the first place. Right, that sense of a belonging, that sense of longing and being a part of something that was beyond ourselves in a world where we like to submit to another, to dominate another, to feel the joys and sensation of pain or inflicting pain, right? Longing to fig somebody or spank somebody or bind somebody or tie them up. But we're not doing that anymore. We're neatly starting to check boxes and create quote unquote spaces and safety areas in case you are offended at something you see or watch or view. It's the world of kink. When I first was introduced to it, one of the first things I saw was somebody getting a needle. What are those things that women wear? It wasn't a needle harness, a needle corset. Right. This male sub was there in front of his mistress, and he went through his rituals and his protocols, and she was a nurse. I found out later on, and she put needles through his back, and there was blood and exposure and all of these things, and it was just fascinating to watch. And then she tied this beautiful silk ribbon, and then that was it. But if we're going to start being offended by everything, what are we going to really draw the line to? The whole point of kink was that we came into the world because it offended people who weren't involved in such things. So we found a world to connect with others that do enjoy those things. But now we're starting to say, or these small minority groups, and they're really getting to the point. They're not small because they're small, but they make the most noise. That they're offended about everything they're seeing. I don't really see how this is going to healthily in a healthy manner or way, benefit the community. If everybody is just evil, if everybody's reprehensible, why be around anybody? Why even associate with the community if you're so offended? Are there certain things about the community that should change? Well, yeah, probably, but that's not for me to say, because I still live by a philosophy of your kink is not my kink, and I'm not here to judge it. But we're at a point that we're censoring people's thoughts, that we're restricting what they can say because it's going to offend somebody. Well, I don't, and I don't believe in that. And as long as we have free speech to think, we have to be able to critically come back against these ideas. The D.I.E philosophy isn't healthy. It's healthy in some respects that, sure, it's welcoming, and I want to see more people from different backgrounds come in and present their world of kink, but I'm not going to be lectured to by people that don't know enough, that are only going to tell me about their personal experiences and how that makes them feel, and then how we have to shape the world around those personal beliefs with no factual or statistical basis. It's not going to work. I wouldn't at least participate in that part of the community any longer. I'd move to a different fraction that I'm more identified with. But that's then the other problem, because you can't, if we keep doing that, then what ends up happening is then they start labeling you as a bigot. They call you a racist. They call you homophobic. They call you an ableist, misogynist, misandric. It doesn't really matter. And we go back to they throw names, and that becomes the other uptick with the people who follow the D.I.E philosophy. If we keep censoring thoughts because we find them offensive, even the ones that aren't really offensive, but we're making them to the point that we are oversensitive and making these thoughts sensitive for ourselves so we can be offended. I don't really understand how some of these people can function in everyday normal society, let alone within a community that is very far diverse, and then allow these same people to start dictating the rules and dictating what is and what isn't allowed to be said, or who is and who isn't allowed to be involved. That doesn't sound to me at all like a dictatorship. But I can tell you one thing, that's not a community that I want to be a part of. And the great part about BDSM is I don't really think we're ever going to go that way. I tend not to pay too much attention to these people, but the reality is they are here, they're not going away. And we have to learn to operate within the community. The real question is for those that follow, that are die-hard D.I.E philosophers, that believe in this, that breathe it, that wake up and go, God, what can I be a victim of today? What's not diverse enough for me today? What's not inclusive enough for me today? Where is there not enough equity in it in the day for me? How do we coexist in a world of BDSM, which is all inclusive, very diverse, very vast? How do we exist in a world with those people that want to dictate everything else, that want to be victimized? I think that's a question that's going to take a lot longer to answer. But time's going to tell. So when I see these people, I challenge them the best I can. And I think personally it's about having a conversation. We have to keep having conversations. We have to keep talking to each other. It's not only a fundamental and cornerstone foundation of society, it's how relationships are going to grow and move forward. It's a lot to think about. I'm not saying there's not space for some people for diversity, and there's not space for inclusivity, and there's not space for equity. But we have to be careful how we interpret these things when we have so steadfastly thrust them into society, especially something like that's already hugely diverse as BDSM, and claim it's not diverse at all. You really should probably start asking yourself where the trouble really lies. Is it really within a community like BDSM, or is it within inside of myself? Maybe it's a good time for some self-reflection. Until next time, everyone, be safe and stay kinky.